I really want to know, Sharon.
I really want to know too. I want to know so bad. Well, good morning and welcome to the latest episode of the Project Failure Files. This series is for anyone who manages projects for a living. If you've been project, program, product, group, operations manager, maybe even own your own business, wear all the hats, then this weekly series is for you. I'm Sharon Weaver, CEO of Smarter Consulting.
And I am Christian Buckley, the founder of Collab Talk. And welcome to another episode of our series where Sharon and I explore project management topics from the perspective of what not to do as you manage projects. In each episode of the Project Failure Files, we'll talk about some of the common pitfalls, sharing some personal stories and experiences, and explore strategies and best practices to help you to be successful.
In this episode, we are talking about one of the most widely discussed issues in all of project management. You hear this all the time.
Yep.
Mitigating scope creep. And as a technology consultant, I don't think a week goes by that scope creep doesn't pop up in one or more projects.
There's a process for that, Sharon. It's a PCR. Fill out the PCR. Project change request. But yeah, I mean, scope, I mean, think about it. It's like sprawl in collaboration. And people say, oh, we got to fight. We got this problem with sprawl. It's like, no, sprawl means people are using the technology. Scope creep is kind of like that. It's inevitable. But I think we'll talk about it. So, but it's more about how you manage it. And as with every episode, we're going to share our stories, our opinions on this thing, but feel free to comment throughout. Share your experiences, any examples or feedback that we may have missed, and we'll try to address those issues right here live.
Okay, let's get started by answering the question, what the heck is scope creep?
Well, I think by definition, scope creep has more to do with like uncontrolled expansion of a project scope. So that might result in new features, new direction for the project, requirements, tasks, anything that wasn't part of that original plan. I mean, you cannot plan for everything. And usually, and it's funny because we were actually just going through this activity with building out scope of work documentation this past week. And as much as you try to plan out and anticipate using your years of experience to cover all of the various scenarios and build that into the scope, it's going to happen. There will be requests. There's things that you didn't think of, that you forgot of, or that are outside of, that are relevant to the project, to the task at hand, but are outside of that normal pattern.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always like to think of it as scope creep is really anything that you get asked to do that wasn't in the original request. And so it's that idea of, how sometimes someone will be like, hey, can you run to the store and grab, milk? And you're like, sure, no problem. I'll run in the store and grab milk. And while you're at the store, your kid messages you or your spouse messages you or whatever and says, while you're at the store, it would be nice if, right? And so I always laugh, scope creep always starts with, wouldn't it be nice if, or could you, or, all these extra things. It's something outside of that original request that maybe you didn't define up front.
Well, and that's the biggest problem though, is that if you have a poorly designed project request, if you are just unclear on, what are the requirements for this effort, what are we actually talking about doing here? So I know that with a lot of, marketing content, or an executive just says, well, here's the basic, the project, the high level, you've got that 50,000 foot level description. You cannot build a detailed timeline around 50,000 foot perspective.
But it's so easy. We just need to do the thing. Just do the thing.
But then you start involving in, because you've got that high level project. You then start going, say, well, who does this actually impact? Who are our stakeholders? Who should be involved in this? And then they bring into each of their perspectives. And, oh, I didn't really think of that. I was looking at it from an IT standpoint, but now we have the business units that also have their voice. And I didn't realize if we did X, then Y will happen and this Z impact happens over here. You have to go back and adjust for those things. Now, hopefully, when you're building out your plan, your strategy for the project, you're getting those inputs before you put in your final scope of work, that estimate. But even if you spent months in planning, like I've talked about in past episodes, how I was back in the mid 90s was working on this, what ended up being an 18-month project for doing data center consolidation. So 3 down into 1 location. And at the same time, we did hardware updates and rolled out new software, kind of all these things over 18 months. And it was meticulously planned. And yet every planning session with the stakeholder groups, there was something else. And so I don't know if you've had a similar experience, Sharon.
I so many. I have so many experiences. No, I think it's the same thing. It's, it's back to that unclear requirements, not knowing what you're agreeing to in the first place. I can honestly say that when I was young, I had an experience that like really taught me lessons, because you don't know what you don't know, right? When you're first doing this. And I think my biggest story about this is early in my career, I took on a fixed bid statement of work that I did for a client. And they were like, oh yeah, here's what you need to do. We had conversations. I looked at everything. I felt like I knew exactly what was going on. We got into it. I know this is going to shock you. There was far more involved than what was like at the surface level when we first stepped into it. And ultimately, I learned a very important lesson about defining scope through the process of that project, because I ended up having to do more work than I expected for the same amount of money, because I had not adequately really done my due diligence to define that scope well.
Yeah. It's funny. I was thinking on this topic. One of my sons had so he went out, was excited to start his own business. They were doing with a buddy of his, or a couple buddies, they were doing Christmas lights. And so he learned very quickly. He, by the way, folks, did too. He's in sales and is very successful, and that side of it, but he wanted to go into business for himself, and he made good money doing this. But he ran into a scenario where he had people, and it always happens with the people that he knew personally. And so they felt like they could expand the scope of the project. So he went in and did a bid, and then they asked for other things. And somewhere there was miscommunication. They had their understanding was that it would all be within that cost that was given initially. It about doubled the cost of doing the project. And he ended up doing it for them, and he's just like, I'm never going to go back to them as a customer, or if I do, I'll be very clear. But he learned that lesson of not being upfront, clear. And I say this all the time. It's like, as a project manager, you sometimes have to be clinical in your approach. This is what it is. This is the facts. I'm not moving on. This is what this is.
This is life lessons, right? It's setting clear expectations so that we're all kind of starting from the same place.
Yeah, I learned a lesson. Again, this is one of those things where this is 30 years ago, and I'm grateful that I had this experience early on. But when I was a business analyst, and I was this whole issue of we were trying to solve a problem in the company. I was going and trying to define the scope of this issue to how to solve it. And so I was gathering requirements. And I know some people hate that phrase of gather requirements. Like, no, what are the desired outputs? It's like, whatever, what I'm talking about. Semantics aside, I was gathering requirements from that. And so the requirements that I was collecting from these internal groups were based on, like, their experience was what they had today, the tools, the system they had today. So I asked the requirements. It was through the lens of their understanding of what was there today. We then showed them what we were thinking with this new technology. And so these new applications that could do all of these other things, which they never dreamed of. And suddenly they started feeding in. So we had already built our plan. We show them some of the new technology. They start saying, oh, we're missing all these other requirements that were based on now what they could see, what was possible using the new technology. So the learning for me early on was like, well, how soon do you show them the art of what's possible, but tempered by what do you actually need was the business need?
Yeah.
And
Well,
yeah,
and without getting too far off on a whole nother tangent, this is where, you start talking about methodologies and you think about the idea of kind of, I know, when I started, it was very heavily formal waterfall. Like you define all the
yep,
requirements up front, it's
yep.
100% solidified, and then it passes over. We started bringing things like lean and agile into the mix where it's like, we don't know what we don't know. So we're going to maybe take a small amount of it and define what we do know, and as more becomes more apparent, we'll be able to do that. But it's always this kind of balancing effort of how far can you go with what you know now, and what do you think you're going to uncover as you kind of go forward in the project.
If you have a strong change management process, so I talked about PCRs. If you have that well documented, it's part of like now I have like a master service agreement. I know you do the exact same thing. I do the scope of work. I go through and I try to be very meticulous of here's what is not included, and that's where I can have like broader swipes of the brush of like these are areas that are just have nothing to do with this that are, and so you can add in again your project experience, knowing what other clients have done, and say like these are not included. If like it would be great to do these things as a consultant, more hours is always fantastic, but it would be an additional scope of work as a secondary project that would be tied to this project. But so having a process in place, again, the communication is so critical of this because you can have your methodology be if you're not clear on the communication, then a lot of the times where if you have a insistent customer, then you might get stuck having to deliver something that you never intended, but because you didn't have clear communication around that thing. So it's, I mean, because you don't want to do something that's going to impact the current project because of these additional requests. So you have to find that balance sometimes.
Yeah.
And so understanding the boundaries of, what is in and out of scope, and the themes or the types of requests that would be in and out of scope has to be discussed up front.
Yeah, and I would add, whether you're a project manager, a business analyst, whatever role you're in, when you're dealing with scope, and we talk about communication, making sure that everything is communicated well. I want to add in when we talk about elicitation, which is that whole idea of getting the requirements and documenting them. Make sure that communication is documented, not just verbalized, right? So this isn't just a conversation where I say, "Oh, I'll do this," and you're like, "Yay, that's great." We're talking about, to your point, that clinical level of making sure that it's written down, it's reviewed, and it's signed off by somebody in authority to say, yes, I agree that this is the scope that we're talking about.
Sharon, do you have any horror stories of the impact of scope creep that you could share?
Oh, geez. Yeah. So back to my comment from earlier, my story from many years ago. I really think that's probably one of the worst, and really it's because I was young and I was naive and I was ignorant. I'm going to use the word ignorant because I was kind of new at this and I was managing my own project. And what ended up really happening is that because I did not do this, right? I didn't pay attention to it. I didn't pay attention to what was in it. I just wrote down some very minimal scope. I ended up really doing a lot of extra work, and I had a lot of extra stress out of that. That ended up really kind of being a little bit of a nightmare for me. There was a lot of extra work that took me way more time than I expected. I ended up having to put my own time in far beyond what I thought I was going to. And there was even kind of like a set of skills that I ended up having to have people help me with to finish the project and deliver the project in a way that I hadn't originally planned on, just because I didn't properly, limit and define what was in and out of scope at the beginning. And it really is that simple. I know it sounds like, oh, it shouldn't be that simple. It really is that simple. I didn't, manage the expectations and define it well enough. And so I probably ended up working mean, several months of extra work that I really truly wasn't paid for because just, I didn't clarify it well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've all had this where, I mean, obviously, um, like we've, so here's another common scenario is that, talking about impact on timeline is that I had a client that I worked with for about 2.5 years, and something that they just was an ongoing problem. It was so frustrating with the COO that I would give an estimate of time for that project and cost, kind of all those different things. And but time being the most sensitive thing, as they were really, it was around go to market activities for product releases and things like that. And so timeline, and then but he would constantly uh, ask for more and more and more within that, but then expect that that original timeline would never budge. But you said, I'm like, that's before you added in all of these other things. There's no way. It was like you committed to that time. Like, we can't move the time frame. Like, then you got to lose some of these features. Well, you've committed to the features. Like, no, 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 no. Like, and so I pushed back to that PCR process. And thankfully, the CEO was a logical person, kind of understood where the disconnect was, and pushed back on that. But again, impacts of scope creep, timeline, of course, budget, I've had that. Reduced quality to the output, yeah, it can suffer when the teams are having to stretch their activities, or like a compressed timeline. What happens? What gets dropped? With software, it's often like testing, you know, not something
Training,
that you want to, yeah, training,
documentation.
yeah, little details, yeah, little things. But it's also very, I'd say, demoralizing for the team that stuff has to be compressed, because
Mhm.
you have insufficient process that I'll say it, like, didn't have the backbone to stand up to the stakeholders around this. Um, I wore that badge with pride as a PM early in my career, where I'm like, you committed to delivering on this, all of these dependencies around this, like, you pushed this off, delayed this, like, it all hinges on this. I would go and um tattle on to their managers of like, for to get like, I would pull whatever lever
Escalate.
I could as a PM. And so I was a hard ass PM. And that was some of the feedback I got at the end. I think I've shared this before, the story, but on this one massive project where I was told at the end of the project, like, nobody wants to work on you. Like, you delivered on time and on budget, and the vendor and the internal customers love you, but the team, they all hate you, because I got them to fulfill their commitments. But I learned, the lesson I got out of that was, personally, was, how you do your job is as important as what you do as well. Like, I didn't know that going in. I learned that lesson.
It's
So,
all about
and I
balance.
yeah. Or ultimately, I mean, a scope expanded scope could tank the entire project. So
Mhm.
you don't want project failure either. So
Well, I was just thinking about that, especially in software development. I've seen many, many, many projects where the basis of the design, the architecture of a solution is designed around something specific. And a good example of scope creep as well could be you've designed something around a specific, end goal that you're getting to, and then all of the sudden something shifts to where now the stakeholders want something different, and the problem is that design will be completely upended, and you might have to start from scratch, or you might have to start with new modules, or you might have to switch the way that you're doing things, simply because there's a big enough change that it's going to impact your original architecture, original design. And I think that's as big of a risk as anything sometimes to a solution.
yeah, sorry, this is a sideways discussion. I won't go into in depth about it, but just it reminded me of, I did this project. So this worked for this startup back in 2001. And to give you an idea of the size, it was a 280 million venture capital backed startup. So small startup.
Not big, not big.
And but looking at exactly that was around demand planning, was building, that the cost of change was so huge
Mhm.
in the high tech manufacturing sector. anything that they could do to, as part of this demand planning, was basically like, if we made this design change, how would that impact to when that with a new design, that product was manufactured and on trucks going to stores? Like, they needed to be able to go in and say, based on this design change, here's the downstream impact of that, to can we deliver this before, holiday sales wave begins? And so companies would spend these, millions of dollars on getting better at that planning process to know their design cycle. I mean, even like Microsoft had their cadence, their annual cadence, around design and building products. And then the old model, like every 3-4 years of a new version of that product. But I mean, it was intense, 3-4 years, and all the build cycles within that. And now, of course, everything is evergreen. There's constantly updates. It's gotten even more smaller releases, but more frequent releases of those things. But yeah, I mean, anyways, it's a fascinating space. The fact that there's science behind scope creep, and again, millions of dollars spent by individual companies to try and reduce the impact of scope creep.
Yeah, there's an entire industry built around quality control and quality management, and the whole point of that is exactly that, is we know that change in and of itself is expensive, and the more and the bigger the change, the more expensive it gets. And so, to your point, the more that we can minimize that change going forward and manage it well, the, just the less it kind of runs away with us.
That's a great point, because it's exactly that point. Change is more expensive the further along you are in the process.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can identify that up front, if you can flag that, you involve in it sometimes, and it happens. Again, this is why I say it scope creep is inevitable,
Mm-hmm.
because what happens is you go through and you're clarifying the scope of that project, that work breakdown structure. Here's what's actually going to happen for us to execute. People will come forward with more. Their lens of understanding gets more specific. They say, "Oh, you know what? And there's this other thing that you neglected." So that would be within the scope. Still could impact time, cost, personnel, all of the levers that a PM has. But the closer to the front of the project you can identify those things and fit it in, less time and effort is. Like you said, you might get to where you're doing UAT, user acceptance testings, towards the end of that, and realize we missed something huge that requires a re-architecture of the solution.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the big, when we think about iterative methodologies and agile methodologies, the idea behind those types of methodologies is that we're breaking down that whole project into more modular units. And so it's introducing more opportunities where, if there's a change, it's easier to implement that change, as opposed to, carving something out of one giant piece of rock and not having any opportunity for that change to happen.
Yeah. So when you look at, when you think about on this topic, what are your strategies to avoid or to prevent or just to manage changes to scope?
I mean, I think you said it, you've said it a couple of times now, and I want to reiterate it, is understanding that scope creep is not a bad thing, right? Scope creep will happen. It's how are you managing it that's important. So it's identifying and being really clear about what your initial requirements are, and having a strategy or a plan for the changes that will inevitably come along. I think that first and foremost is probably the most important.
I often say, and I've said in other episodes here in this series, that organizations that are good at change management, that's a strength in your organization. Your culture is built around that. Nobody feels like, hey, I'm going to be the bringer of bad news and I'll get beat up by everybody for that. It's like, no, you reward people, recognize people for bringing in when they identify it, surfacing issues as quickly as possible. But having a robust model for change management is so critical. And it could be on the business side, on the IT, the technical side. I mean, it doesn't matter where it is in the organization, but that's it's a cultural initiative. It's something that you have to strive to be good at that process. And then it's all around communication, which is again what we talk about all the time. You can have the best plans in the world, but if you don't adequately communicate that out to the masses, doesn't matter how well you planned for. You're not going to get the right input if your communication structures are in place. So again, you can have a launch of a project, have everybody that you think is involved, and then get 6 weeks into a project and realize we had a bunch of the wrong people. They're like, we needed to cast a wider net around this. Here's what we're doing. Encourage people that, hey, I wasn't invited to that. I guess I just don't need to know. No, have employees that are like, look at, hey, we're about to do the kickoff. Does anybody know that I did this similar project to this like 2 years ago for my last company? No one asked me about this. And can I share my experiences around that? So yeah, that's a whole nother issue of like, are we leveraging people? That's another topic, Sharon, that I think we need to do of like, how are we leveraging the people that we have in our organization?
Lessons learned.
Yeah.
Lessons learned is a huge one. And while you're noting that down, I think, once again, I just want to reiterate that, when you're talking about communication, which I agree with, having good, solid communication and open communication around the project, around change management, make sure that it's written documentation, documentation, right? Or communication, verbal communication is great because we really want to talk to people, but we want to make sure that it's something that is, something that people can see, it's signed off on, people have bought into, because communication, and there's whole topics on this, but it's more than just we said it in a meeting, but like this is actually documented and agreed and signed off on by the group.
One of the things that I love, and I know we've talked about this, is like I love like the whole 4-blocker methodology. This idea of like every time we go into a status call that we have, like, here's the plan of record. Here's everything that we know that we're working on. This is not changed. If something has been modified, the scope has been increased. It's been through the PCR process. That's the only update to that. So it's solid and largely unmoving. And then, here's what we've delivered. Here's what was accomplished, kind of thing. Then down another quadrant, it's here's the risks. Here's here's what we could do to mitigate. And then the last one is here's the plan, the motion forward, the next steps, what we're doing in the next week, 2 weeks. Here are my asks. Here where I need your help on these items. And so somebody coming in, again, this is about communication. It's about being flexible and recognizing that change happens. Here's what we think the impacts are. But it also forces you to then prioritize. What are the decisions? Because you can make a decision on it's going to increase the budget, it's going to increase the number of resource people that are working on it, or the budget just got blown out, but the business says, got to do it, need to do it. Or it's like, if time can't change because we've got to go to market, if the budget can't change, the resources can't change, well, that kind of clinches it on what you can and can't do.
Right.
So it forces you to prioritize.
I can't tell you how many meetings I've sat on, how many, different backlog meetings that I've sat on where things like that have come up, and, maybe a VP comes in and says, we have to do this. Like it's, some sort of a requirement or something that happens from the business side. And we're like, okay, what are we going to move to make that happen? So there's always that negotiation. But to your point, it's being firm around what is the scope that we're agreeing to, and what are we doing and what are we not doing, so that everybody knows what the priorities are.
Yeah. I realized I was running the wrong banners here. I wasn't paying attention. Sorry about that. It was a little bit confusing. What are these details up here? Wrong thing. So anyway, it's the beauty of doing live, folks. We are actually live here. So there's our contact information. The other thing too is communicating out broadly of constantly of what's in scope and out of scope. And like I've shared the experience of a couple times different companies I worked with where I did kind of a forced exercise where I like a whiteboard and I did like, here's the parking lot of all the requests. Here's all the things in order and priority of the projects, the ETA who's delivering those. And it was just to we were getting flooded by, and this is like running PMOs, running, project management organizations, where we're like shared services teams, all of these different inputs. Like every day, people requesting new things. Some they could do on their own, some that they could go get their own resource, some that were like, we needed to do, but okay. And I would constantly ask, your new request, here's the priorities we're working on with, and that are staffed. Is it more important than the first one? No. Is it more important than this one? No. Is it more important? Like we go through that exercise. All right. You've agreed that it is less important than these, and that puts it next in line, but I don't have people. Can you give me more budget? Can you give me people that I can borrow? Can I hire contractors get around this to be able to deliver that for you? Otherwise, you have to wait until these are done, and and that give that portfolio view of projects. And interesting things happen when people are aware of that. They make decisions. There was no budget. Suddenly they find budget. There was no time. Hey, we have this additional time, whatever that is. So yeah, prioritization, monitoring and tracking those things and communicating, reporting back on that so people can see here's the progress that's made, which might, you've complete a task. It maybe frees somebody up to do something else. You reprioritize what can and can't be done. Again, may free up budget and people and time to go and solve those scope issues.
Yeah, I definitely think you have to set expectations. And, I know we don't push a methodology. We just say have one, right? Have a good methodology and follow it. But I will tell you that the more iterative your methodology is to this point, the more opportunity you have to discuss those changes, the more opportunity you have to redefine priorities, to redefine scope, to redefine things like that throughout the process of the project itself. So it does give that benefit for sure.
Well, thinking of some practical tips, I mean, I think you said it earlier on too, is that, the first and foremost, document everything. Have your process documented. Have this is the phase one timeline. Here's the period through which we're going to review this timeline and the activities, and have that feedback and out there. I mean, you're not doing an official launch event, an activity around a new project, because you want high five and kudos from everybody in your organization. You're doing that to get feedback. Are we missing something from this? We're delivering this for the company. What's missing from this? And then you use that as your baseline for change. So once it's locked down, and I'm not saying locked down like the old waterfall delivery method of this, like it's locked and we're going to deliver it. 2 years later, you've delivered a project that nobody needs anymore. No, it's that you have a baseline for the project that you lock down, so you understand what is then in or out of scope for the normal, expansion and retraction of a project that's well defined, and then what is outside of the scope. And then what else? What are your other practical tips?
I definitely would say build contingency in. So if you have flexibility within your project plan to basically recognize that there will be change at some point, then when that change does come, you have a way to be able to manage that and be able to understand, like, how are things going to move around? How are things going to shift? How are you going to redefine your priorities or redefine the work that you're working on?
Yeah, and I think that and part of that, it all can happen if you are actively engaged with people, having conversations around that. I mean, you can't hide behind a spreadsheet or a project plan. You need to be going and having conversations, because sometimes getting that feedback to understand, again, hopefully you're doing this early on, means that you have to understand that some people are perfectly comfortable sitting in a room with 20 people and speaking their mind and disagreeing with something or interjecting or adding in their piece. Others, you need to go and have a behind closed door one-on-one conversation to draw it out of them. And so having those, feeling like we're talking about this all the time, feedback loops everywhere, so that different personalities, different styles can provide their input in the process, but be engaged. And then again, regularly review and reassess that scope. That's why I like the 4 blocker model. There's the plan of record, and remind people constantly of that plan of record.
Yeah, I think it's funny, if you watch a lot of the shows, especially like reality shows on TV, especially like, competition shows, they always kind of reassemble and they're like, I want to remind you guys why we're here. I want to remind you guys what we're trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes we forget to do that in the business world. I think sometimes we get so busy doing the day-to-day grind that we forget to come back together and say, wait, what is it we're trying to accomplish again? And so I think it's always a good tip, especially for a project manager or for a leader or for somebody who's responsible for the vision of where you're headed, to sit everybody down every once in a while and say, are we all still on the same page? Are we all still going the same way, have the same goal, trying to tackle the same thing, so that everybody goes, okay, yes. And everybody kind of rebuys into that vision and says, yes, we're all on the same page. And then I find that everything tends to go better, because then if scope creep does come in, I think everybody is more aware of, wait, that wasn't what we just talked about. I now know that this is something that's outside of what we said the plan was.
Just something you said that just reminded me of this. So there's this speaker who's like on business and tech topics. So this is like over 20 years ago, but was one of the best presenters that I had ever seen. And one of the things that he talked about, I don't know where he didn't create this, but he said up front, he's that when I go and I present, I tell people what I'm going to be presenting to them. I then go through and I tell them the information throughout, and I follow that structure. And I even mention, like, here I am in this, and he goes back in his slides, goes back where you see the agenda and highlighted like where he is in that process, the breadcrumbs of that. And then at the end of the presentation, he reminds them of, here's what I presented to you over the last hour on these topics. And one of the things, that the speaker's name was Romanus Walter, and he was fantastic. I'm sure he's still out there doing this. But the other thing that he did that I had never seen before was that when he was, and he had did a keynote for us, and he was doing a warm, but he had somebody sitting there with a binder, and it was his complete presentation. And as he was giving it live at the event, he had somebody going through and writing notes on the presentation, like people laughed here when they were supposed to, or they didn't laugh at this funny part. Then, so he would know to take that back and make modifications to that. It just made me think of that, because it's a very similar process. Is know your audience, engage with the audience, but again, be very clear in your communication up front throughout the process. And then that post-mortem at the end, here's what we did, here's what we learned, here's what went well. I mean, all those things, all of that is so important. And then repeat that pattern again and again.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'd say like a call to action out of this reminder to folks is that you, again, need to be vigilant with the scope. And there's a lot of different strategies. There's different methodologies, as Sharon, as you said earlier. Don't care what methodology, just use a methodology.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a part of every methodology, is manage that scope creep, have a process, have the change request process. And if you're doing that, if you're communicating, if you got the process, then you're going to be able to keep things more in check. You won't stop scope creep from happening. It'll happen, but it'll be well managed scope creep.
And if you're a consultant and you're writing it down, you'll get paid for it.
Yes, that's always a benefit. So, well, that is it for this week's episode. Again, here's the correct information here. But thanks for joining this show this week. Please, if you want to get in contact with Sharon or I, please feel free, reach out to us. You can look us up. We're all over the interwebs. Of course, if you want to watch this or back episodes, everything's out on YouTube. And I do a blog summary as well. So you can go to buckleyplanet.com and find all of the previous episodes under the hashtag Project Failure Files. And we also have the Facebook group if you want to go and share your stories or ask other questions or provide feedback. We'd love to hear from you through any of those channels. And
Absolutely.
Sharon, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.